Welcome, everybody, to the part 3 of the 3-part workshops that we're doing. This one is going to be on recommendations for sampling. So the Water Board, a while back in 2019, we assisted them in creating a sampling demonstration video. And so when I was working on last year, when I was working on this, I found that it really complemented this well. So I incorporated that. You can find it on YouTube. It actually, you can go through the Waterboard's website. It's free access to anybody. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to go over my PowerPoints, and then later, towards the end, I'm going to move over and screen share that video that the Waterboard put out that we helped them, the WGR helped them produce, on basically key components of how to grab samples. Now, that I will say, the video was created for qualified industrial stormwater practitioners, someone with my credentials, but it was such straightforward. It was on a level that anybody can, you don't have to have any kind of special training to have it. So I thought, well, that'd be excellent to share. So that's why I'm going to share that with all you guys today. So let's start on the video here. Again, welcome. I'm just going to touch real quickly. I'm going to mention it at the end though, but I have a certificate I created for training. So if anybody wants to have some sort of proof of training, you can go to Stormwater Awareness Week, to our website, to the resources link, and there's a drop-down menu. You drop down, click on WGR, and you'll see my training certificate. And then below that, you'll see the PowerPoint slides and PDF available for anybody who would like to download them. Okay, so let's start. The Industrial General Stormwater Permit gives sampling guidance in Attachment H. In the opening paragraph of that Attachment H, it recommends using the USA EPA's Stormwater Guidance Monitoring and Sampling Guide, okay, dated in March of 2009, as a detailed guide for proper sampling technique. For the sake of time, given this 1-hour format, we're going to give you some quick general tips on recommendations for performing a compliant IGP sampling. So basically, I'm just going to go over real quick, just take some time to go over some basic tips, some ideas, and then after that, we're going to go to the video, which will also have a lot of tips, but a little more detail. All right. First, you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot. It's hurt. It can be expensive. If you sample carelessly, or if you're not careful, or if you don't collect the representative sample, it can cause issues. So, for example, many times people will grab samples from the wrong location. They think it's an outfall when it turns out it's not. For example, I had a client last year when they asked me to come and help them. They're grabbing samples from a place in their yard. As it turns out, first of all, it wasn't representative. They were grabbing samples from the surface when they should have grabbing samples from inside their drain. And two, where they were grabbing samples, it wasn't where water was leaving the property. So we found where water was leaving their property. We determined what it was. We determined that everything went to that spot. And so, first of all, you need to identify for sure. That's why if you need to have a request for someone to help you, identify for sure where it is your discharge points are. Okay, so this is where our water leaves. This is where the water goes. Okay. Two, make sure you know where all your outfalls are, because the permit requires you to grab samples from each and every outfall. So that's where, again, I use the term outfall for point of discharge, where water leaves your property. I refer to it as an outfall because we did for many years before they wanted to use that definition somewhere else. But so for the sake of this training, if I use the term outfall, I'm referring to water, the point at which your water leaves property, your point of discharge. You want to make sure that you collect representative samples. Samples are no longer not cleaner than average, but also not dirtier. In other words, all our water comes to this point. That's why they want you to grab samples. For example, I have some clients that are blessed to have only one sampling point, because that way they for sure are representative. They're grabbing one sample, all the water goes to that one point. It represents what's leaving their property. So you want to make sure that you collect samples that are coming to that point. For example, if you have a drain where water from your property goes through the drain, but it also enters from the top, you need to collect water from the bottom of the drain where all your water is being represented, not just from the water coming off the surface. Vice versa, we have a client in Stockton where they have 4 drains in their property, 3 drains in their property, but their drains interconnect with the whole neighborhood. So to grab samples from inside their drain is to basically pick up everybody else's stuff, and nobody else is on, as far as I know, anybody else in their streets not on the general permit. So everybody's putting stuff in the storm drain. Who knows what they're putting in there? And so if they carelessly just grab samples from inside the drain, they could be grabbing oil and grease and all types of things that they had no responsibility for. So we ended up identifying their outfalls, basically the 3 drains that we have samples from their surface water. That's representative, because to grab samples from inside the drain, we'll be grabbing samples from the whole neighborhood, which would not be a good idea, especially if you've been in that neighborhood. So you need to think through your program first. Okay, is this for sure where our outfalls are? If you have to do a dye test or something, do a dye test. Just make sure you understand where water lives. 2, okay, when we grab samples, let's make sure that we grab them so they're representative. So you want to make sure that when you grab it, you're not scraping or gouging or stirring up stuff that doesn't stir up. So let's keep going. Section 2.2 of the EPA guidance describes a representative sample as discharges prior to stormwater leaving your facility and at a location downstream from all your industrial material activities. The reason behind requiring such a location is that sample is representative of your facility's discharge, taking into account the types of pollutants and so forth and so on. So let's do it in English, shall we? A representative sample should reflect the quality and quantity of your facility's stormwater discharge. Okay, I think I like my definition a little bit better because it's not nearly as complicated. Last place that water leaves, and it represents what is leaving your property. Now, what you want to do is it starts with good planning. You do need to understand the general permit. IGP stands for Industrial General Stormwater Permit, or IGP. Okay, so I may refer to IGP as general permit interchangeably. So you want to make sure, if you haven't seen part 2 of my training, that you make sure and go over part 1 and 2. But part 2 is we talk about what do you expect to do? What are the sampling requirements? How many samples am I supposed to take? What's a qualified storm event? Stuff like that, okay? Make sure that you have a compliant stormwater pollution prevention plan, which includes your monitoring section in as well. And the MIP should describe what you are sampling for and where your sampling locations are, okay? You should have an account with the environmental credit. In other words, you should have a lab that's ELAB certified, okay? It's an accreditation program that's determined to make sure that this lab has shown that it is shown to be able to produce accurate results. Have your sampling bottles and equipment ready before the wet season starts. So I would do it now because we don't have, at least in Stockton area, we don't have any rain forecasted for the next couple of days. So I would definitely, if you don't have your sampling kits or sampling bottles together, I would definitely get it together as soon as possible. And for me, what I recommend is having your chain of custody partially filled out. Have your form ready to go. Have the name of your facility, what you're sampling for. You know, some labs allow us to use our chain of custody rather than theirs. So I customize it and I put stuff on it. Basically, is that way I don't have to think about writing down, oh, what are they sampling for or what method. It's already on there. It saves time and it also helps with accuracy. As previously stated, smart sampling starts with planning ahead. Give yourself every chance for a positive sampling result by installing BMPs before it rains. So now's the time. Now's the time to put your BMPs in place. Definitely, if you have inserts, or if you use socks, or if you have anything else, now's the time to start prepping your property, getting ready before the rains come in. Now is actually a great time right now because the rains should be coming in the near future. And so your old BMPs need to be removed and fresh ones put in. Just get ready. Make sure you, if you have a chance to clean out your your drains. And I'll have some clients who every couple of years they actually clean out their drainage system. Whatever you want to do to get ready for the season, I would do it. Definitely replace it. For example, if you use compost socks or something like that, I would pull them all out and replace them with fresh ones. You want to just find ways to make sure that all your stuff is good to go. If you can, if you have room in your property, and if it's possible, if you can put things in like retention or detention ponds, berms, vegetative swales, things where it slows water down or makes water soak into the ground, where water can, especially for example, if you have a nice long ditch, if you put some small check dams to slow the water down, let some of the solids pillow out and have growth in there, with things that'll help. By the time the water leaves your property, it's had a chance to filter out stuff. Those are great things. But again, this is stuff that needs to be put in place before the rain season now, or at least in process early in the season. Reducing stormwater discharges is one of the advanced BMPs listed in the IGP. So we talked about ponds or squares, and basically that's one I like. So, because you have a couple of advanced BMPs or structural physical BMPs, advanced BMPs. One is treatments, what's called treatment controls, which we talked about in the first part 1 of the training I did today. And in treatment controls, you have to have a professional engineer. You have to have engineer sign off that yes, this can meet a certain set of standards. Okay, but for a lot of people, they can't either afford that or even have the room to build something that'll match the standards that are outlined in the permit for a treatment BMP designation. But you can still put in a smaller pond, which is great. Anything you can do to help hold on to water that is soaked into the ground, anything that will help water to travel through vegetative swells so it can soak up or pull out pollutants, anything you can do to help slow the water down, pill out solids, things like that, those are great. And I recommend it and doing those. And the water board encourages you, hey, they use the term encourage to utilize BMPs that infiltrate and reuse stormwater where feasible. I used to have a client, they're out of the state now. I used to have a client that would capture the stormwater and actually use it in their process. They'd capture it, contain it, and then reuse it in the process. That's awesome. So there's different options. And for some people, they can go to more. I have one client that they actually have underground impoundment where they put in underground infiltration structures, so that way they capture the water. Water goes into the infiltration. It has an entrance where they capture solids, and it's solid, and it filters out oils and greases and stuff like that, which they clean out. And the water, so far, they haven't had any discharges since they put the infiltration in place. And the water goes in and soaks into the ground, and they save a lot of the surface space because they have underground infiltration. That's a little more extensive, a little more expensive, but ultimately, if you can create one big enough, you can either, if you can create to handle an 100 percentile storm or a known requirements, you can get out. Or even if you create a 80 percentile storm, then you'll probably almost never have a discharge. So there's a lot of positives to putting things in to capture water to have it soak into the ground. Remember, from part 2 of the IGP basics workshop that we had earlier, you only need to sample if there's a discharge. If there's no discharge, you are not required to sample. So like I said in my last class I had, a lot of people get in trouble when they grab samples. Back in 2007, we had a client that was grabbing samples, and they do a lot of recycling, and it came back high with a couple of metals, and they're like, oh man, we're in trouble. So they called a supervisor in. He went in and said, okay, where's your outfall? And they go, outfall? He goes, yeah, where does water leave your property? They go, oh, well, it doesn't leave our property. He goes, there's a pond over here. He goes, all your water? You go, yeah. So he checked on the side, he walked around, and he confirmed, yes, all their water is captured and goes to a pond in the northeast corner of the property. And he says, okay, why'd you grab samples? They go, well, it was raining. He says, yeah, but did the water leave your property? They're like, no. And it showed that they misunderstood. The general permit is a surface water permit. If water does not discharge or leave your property, it doesn't have to be sampled. Now, at the same time, we're not allowed to contaminate groundwater, and that's a whole other set of discussions and legislation or regulation. But in terms of this permit, if water doesn't leave your property, you are not obligated to collect the sample. Okay. One thing I did mention last time, because it was a question that came up and it's important, there are third parties now that are going around suing people on behalf of the environment. So they say. And a lot of them are having to, people who don't discharge, they're accusing them of discharging and lying about it. So what I would recommend for some people who do have ponds, on a heavy rain day, not necessarily a light rain when it's no big deal, but on a day when the rain is fairly heavy, I would go out there towards the end of the day, towards the end of your business hours, and just get a picture of it and document it and say, look, this day we had 2 inches of rain or 1 inch of rain, and look, our pond didn't discharge. And just keep that internally, because when it comes to environmental issues, sometimes you're guilty until proven innocent, unfortunately. So nowadays, the permit does not require you to do this, but I think out of a sense of protection and my experience with a lot of these third parties that have been coming up and just really raking people, I think some of them unfairly over the coals, it's good to document that if you don't have a discharge. So just word of caution. If you have sheet flow, consider installing something to direct and capture your runoff, such as berms to direct the flow, or if you have cutouts, and also if you have sheet flow, if you can get the water to come together at one certain point. I have a client where the water kind of sheet flows towards the gate. So what they did was they kind of put a little bit of a swale in. It's a vegetative swale. They put in some filtration socks in to help filter out that runoff. And then where water leaves, I recommended to them to put a utility box in the ground. And another client actually did that. What they did was they had a front gate, water was leaving. It was sheet flowing. It was like they were having a hard time grabbing samples because the whole driveway just sheet flowed off. So they installed a little berm in. You can see it here. They installed it. I'm not sure if I have a good to use something. They installed a berm here, and the water that sheet flowed in would hit the berm and head that direction. And from this berm here, as you can see over here, the water came this way, flows into the box. The box, you don't want to grab samples. You don't want to grab samples from that. What you want to do is you want to grab samples from the water, drop it into it. So they would have water flowing this way, flow into the box. They'd put their bottles here and collect the water as it poured into the box. And the good thing about these is you can, with the utility box is you can cover what's not being used, and you can keep it as a trip hazard. Okay. So we go on up. Now we're going to have this stuff's going to be here. And I don't know how to get rid of it. That's okay. Anyway, see if I can back up a little bit here. Don't know how to get rid of these annotations once I have them in there, but we'll figure it out. There we go. Perfect. Can you tell I'm not very tech savvy? Okay, moving on.
Aaron, real quick, we have a question.
Yes.
From Cindy on the Casca monthly BMP sheet that asks if photos were taken. Would you check that photos were taken if only want for internal documentation or documentation?
Yes, I would only keep it for internal documentation as backup. Okay, because again, the general permit does not require you to do this, but I recommend doing it as a protection for you. So say you have a pond and all your water goes to a pond and you know it doesn't normally discharge. What I would do, especially in an especially heavy storm, I would occasionally take pictures of the pond before the end of business, because you're only required to grab samples during business hours. So if you're open from Monday to Friday, 7 to 4, shortly before you leave, or shortly before 4 o'clock, take a picture, say, look, here's our pond at 3:50. It's not even close to being discharged. There's no discharge. And then that way you can, and you don't have to do this all the time, but I would do it from time to time, especially in heavy storms, just to show that these are representative storms and this is what we see. This is normal for us, and I would document it and keep it internally. And the only time you want to pull that out is if you need to defend yourself against wrong assumptions or people who make false accusations. I mean, that's my recommendation. Any other questions? That was a great question.
That's the only one for right now.
Perfect. Well, great. If you guys have more questions, throw them in the chat. Rebecca is really great about getting those to me, and I'll make sure to try to answer any questions you have as best I can. All right. So the legal flush. Well, what's this all about? Remember the general permit, again, if you saw part 2, if you have it again, you really need to go back and see part 2 because it kind of goes over this. But the general permit allows you up to 4 hours during business hours or within 12 hours prior to business hours to collect a sample. Okay. So with that being said, I had to do a little caveat. People say, okay, rain starts, there's flow. Once there's flow, they need to grab a sample. They say, well, hey, I got 4 hours. So they don't grab a sample right away. Then the rain stops and the flow stops and they missed it. So you don't want to miss the opportunity to collect a sample. But at the same time, if you see that the rain's going long enough and the flow is long enough that you can wait, then as a general rule of thumb, you don't want to attempt to collect samples from the first 5 minutes of a qualified discharge. Again, unless you have a choice. And then there's sometimes where the rain comes in and hits, you have flow, and then it stops. And you need to grab that sample relatively quickly. But if you can let the water run for a while, remember, you have from the start discharge, you have up to 4 hours from the start discharge during business hours to collect the sample, or the next day when you come in. If you have that 12-hour rule, the second one there, basically you already have a flush off. I mean, you've already had previous discharges, so that one really you can grab a sample right away. But when it comes to the discharges that start during business hours and you want to go grab a sample, if you see the storm's going to continue for a while, and if you have flow for a while, let it run off. Why? Are you trying to beat the system? Are you trying to cheat? No. You're surrounded by all types of businesses, manufacturing, recyclers, and in this area quite a bit we have agriculture. So we have lots and lots of dust and stuff in the air, especially nitrates from a lot of the farmers. I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, the air quality was absolutely horrid out in my area here in Lodi because we had all the farmers out there disking their fields and getting ready for the harvest. And there was a lot of, there was prevalent bad air, not from the fires, but just from, the general practices of them getting ready for the harvest season. So all that stuff comes, and my car was covered in dirt, and we're next to the 99 freeway here. We're not that close to a farm. There are farm fields west of us, and so all that stuff drops onto your property. All the cars that drive by with their brake linings, with copper in their brake linings, all this stuff flows in the air and lands on your property. And so when the rain starts, if you can wait a little bit and let everybody else's stuff that gathers on your property that's not your activity, let that go through your BMPs, let that wash off, and then collect your sample. That's what we recommend as a rule. For some people, it's better to grab it right away, but for most people, the majority of people, it's better to wait a little bit, then collect your sample.
We have another question, Aaron.
Yes.
From Cindy.
Yes.
She says, do you admit this on the monthly sheet, or would that get you into trouble somehow?
No, it won't get you into trouble. If you document it and it becomes part of public record, that's fine. You're documenting the fact that you don't discharge. So you can't get in trouble for that. In fact, it can only help. I would just recommend doing it separately as an internal thing. However, if you do put it on your monthly sheet, remember, monthly sheets are for non-stormwater discharge observations and on a day without rain. So I wouldn't necessarily mix something having to do with rain with something that doesn't have to do with rain, which is a monthly. A monthly inspection are dry weather, no rain. You're supposed to do it on a day without precipitation. So I would just document that somewhere separately and internally. Though if you do put it on there, it won't hurt you. That's fine. You're just proving, hey, we don't have a discharge. But again, remember, the monthly inspection is different from stormwater inspections. They're two different things. And we went over that in part 2. So I recommend reviewing in part 2 if there's a question on that. But that's a good question, though. Excellent question. Thank you. Remember, you don't want it cleaner than usual, but neither do you want it dirtier. You want representative. The water that leaves your property, you need to grab samples that represents what your industrial activity does, not what everybody around you does. So when you grab samples, try not to overfill your sample bottles with, especially the ones with preservatives. Now you can have the sample bottles that, the ones, the plastic clear ones, the plastic ones that have nothing in them. The ones, for example, that are for total suspended solids. Because if you remember from part 2, we talked about the 3 basics: pH, total suspended solids, oil, and grease. Total suspended solids has 0 preservative in it. So if you grab a sample and you overfill it, no big deal. There's no preservative. However, oil and grease, on the other hand, it has either sulfuric acid solution or hydrochloric acid in it. And so they want you to, if you can fill it up to the shoulder, at least, but not necessarily all the way to the cap, but at least to the shoulder of the bottle. So that way, you can make sure that you have enough. I've had clients where they fill up these bottles, but they don't fill up all the way. They fill like half of it and turn it in. And so then the lab says, we had not enough to run a sample on this, or we had to raise the standard for this sample because you didn't have enough water for it to run it. So you want to make sure you fill up the bottles, the oil and grease bottles, all the way to the top, at least to where the bottle bends in for the cap at the shoulder there. Okay, so and you're supposed to collect water directly into the oil and grease bottle. They want you, they don't want you to use the secondary. They don't want you to get your oil and grease bottle and fill up another bottle and pour it into it. A lot of people like to sample with something else, a bucket or a boom, and they pour it. According to the proper protocols, you're supposed to collect samples directly into the oil and grease bottle that goes to the lab, if at all possible. Okay, to the extent feasible. Okay, do not scrape or gouge the bottom or the sides of sample location when collecting samples. If you scrape or gouge, you're going to dredge up stuff that doesn't dredge up. That's not normally part of your discharge. you don't want to dirty the water by stirring up unnecessary TSS. Some people, for example, have water that goes down a ditch or goes down a swale, and you step in to grab a sample. You don't want to step in on the sample and grab a sample from the water coming through your legs first, because what you're doing is you're dredging up all this unnecessary stuff. In other words, you want to grab a sample from the water that's leaving your property, that represents water leaving your property. You don't want to stir things up. Only use clean collection equipment and sample bottles. Okay, so basically the sample bottles that come from the lab, they're clean, they're certified clean. Okay, and if you have collection equipment, booms or whatever, make sure you sterilize them. We recommend getting Liquinox. It's a decontaminating soap, and maybe kind of clean off your equipment before you start to use it. You want to store your equipment and bottles in a clean location, places where you're not going to have running vehicles or food. You definitely want to store your bottles away from any kind of hydrocarbons or things that can contaminate them. We highly recommend to use gloves and change them at each location, especially if you have things like metals where, you know, the parts per million. If you're looking for copper, you know, just the NAL for copper is 0.0332 parts per million. I mean, it's incredibly, in my opinion, ridiculously low. So you want to make sure you don't contaminate that. So if you have nitrile or latex gloves, well, we prefer nitrile. We recommend that you use those and consider swapping them out if you have more than one outfall. Also, for me, what's more important is there could be the potential for things in stormwater that you don't want to have come in contact with you. I've collected stormwater from places where I know there's bodily fluids in it from other people. We found waste products from people and animals that have made it to the water. You just don't know what's in the water. There could be someone with drug use, and there could be some sort of chemicals or drugs in the water. And you just don't know. So it's better to be safe and to protect yourself when you collect your sample. Just assume there's something in the water that you don't want to come in contact with you. Okay. So also, you don't want to contaminate your sample, especially if you're, for example, if you grab things like looking for mercury, that's very sensitive. And you're supposed to wear a face mask and all types of things, especially if you're going to sample for mercury. So you want to make sure that you do everything you can to not contaminate your sample. But as far as I'm concerned, what's more important is protecting yourself. Make sure your gloves are on. Make sure that you're protecting yourself. If you can wear gloves or glasses or safety glasses, I would recommend it. Things so that it doesn't come in contact with you. You definitely want to do smoking or eating or drinking while sampling. That's just common sense. Plus, again, you don't know what's in the water. You never want to collect samples. You never want to collect samples near a running vehicle. So if you go to a drain where you could pull up in your car, I recommend pull up the car where you have to step away from the car a little bit to get to the drain, and you want to park so that you're not upwind of your sample. Again, it's possible that some of these samples can be so sensitive they can affect it. Possibly not, but why risk it? So, and you don't want to open your bottles until you're actually grabbing your sample. So these bottles come guaranteed sterilized from the lab. So you don't want to compromise that. You want to keep the bottles closed until you open them up to collect your sample. Okay. Don't breathe, sneeze, cough, or in the direction of your sample. If you have to breathe or cough, whatever, step away, look away. You definitely don't want to do anything that can compromise your sample. And then, you know, make sure that when you grab your samples, you have to put them and keep them at 4 degrees Celsius. So you want to keep them in an ice chest that's clean, that you can use ice or cold. Some people use blue ice. My preference is just regular water ice. And get them to the lab as soon as you can. And again, as a side note from last time, make sure you test your pH within 15 minutes of collecting your sample. So the permit, if your pH is at baseline, the permit allows you to use pH strips. If you get, as a point of recommendation, if you do get those pH paper, those strips, you want to test it first. I've had clients where they're reporting pH of 4s and 4s and 5s. I said, wait a minute, your water's not acidic. And then kind of find out all the strips they had, the whole batch was bad. They bought a new set of batches and tested it, and all the water came back good. They tested it in buffer I gave them, and the pH strips came back completely opposite of the buffer, whereas when they use a calibrated meter, the calibrated meter was showing the accurate sampling. So for myself, I would much prefer to have a calibrated meter over using pH paper. It may be a little more complicated, but it's more accurate. You want to only store your samples in clean ice chests, like we talked about. In 2019, the Water Board created a training video, and we talked about this. It's called Stormwater Sampling, a Field Guide, to give qualified industrial stormwater practitioners, someone like me, some general guidance on approaches to collecting representative stormwater samples for general permit clients, okay? So there are a couple of assumptions in this video that I need to make sure that you know. One, the person's watching this video, they understand them as being QUISPs or QUISP candidates. In other words, people who are going to be QUISPs. And so with understanding, those people should already have a good working knowledge of the general permit. It's hard for me to see someone with my credentials who doesn't know the permit. The whole point of the credentials is to say, hey, I know the industrial general stormwater permit. And so they're assuming people who watch this video have some background on it. But with that being said, they're very good videos and they have very good advice. So whether you're a QUISP or not, you're going to benefit from watching these videos. They're going to be very helpful. They give you good tips on recommendations for samples. So let's switch over. I'm going to switch my share and I'm going to put on, I went through the Water Board's website and I'm linking into YouTube now. I have it on YouTube, but this is a generally open thing. So I'm going to switch over right now to the YouTube channel and I'm going to put it on for you. And this video is only 15 minutes, but it's got a lot of good information. I recommend that if you can, take notes on it because it'll give you some real good recommendations. So let me see if I can find where I have it here. Share.
When it comes to collecting stormwater samples, there are compliant techniques and not so compliant techniques that you can use to get the job done. Hi, I'm Shuka Rastagarpur with the Division of Water Quality at the State Water Resources Control Board. And in this video, we hope to give you, the qualified industrial stormwater practitioner, some guidance and practical tips for collecting representative stormwater samples.
I'm Brandon Rosenboom, also with the Division of Water Quality at the State Water Resources Control Board. Many times, collecting a representative sample is a combination of good planning and adapting to current conditions. The goal of this video is not to give you a stormwater sampling manual, but rather to share important concepts that will help you think on your feet and collect a representative sample out in the real world.
Yes, every facility is different, so there's no one-size-fits-all approach. What you see in this video might work for one facility and not another. Try to see past the specific examples and look for the underlying concepts which apply to each facility.
Before we get started though, this video is not intended to be a stormwater sampling crash course. There are a few things that we are expecting you to know. As a QUISP, you should have a working knowledge of the California Water Board's Industrial General Permit and its sampling requirements. The facility you are working with should also have a compliant SWIP in place with a description of the facility's discharge points, sampling locations, and the required sampling parameters.
You should also have a working relationship with an analytical laboratory that is part of the Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, also known as ELAP. You should have a sample kit with the correct number and types of laboratory supplied sample containers for the facility. Furthermore, you should know how to fill out the chain of custody form and determine how the samples will be delivered to the lab within the appropriate holding times. You should also be familiar with the discharge characteristics of the facility, the time constraints for sampling storm events, and how many sampling events are required. Also, you should research and know any exceptions to the sampling requirements, such as unsafe conditions, outside of facility operating hours, and such. But requirements can change with time, so make sure you check with the current industrial general permit.
Think through the facility operating hours and make sure a sampler is ready to respond during normal operating hours. So, why do we collect stormwater samples? What are we trying to determine?
The California Water Board's Industrial General Permit requires each facility operator to sample stormwater runoff discharging from their property in order to gauge the effectiveness of their pollution prevention program and best management practices.
And because these stormwater samples are evaluating the facility's effectiveness at preventing or removing pollutants, they should be representative. What does representative mean? Well, a representative sample gives an unbiased snapshot of stormwater quality associated with the facility's industrial activity.
A representative sample should not be the cleanest water you can find, and it also shouldn't be the dirtiest. You can think of a representative sample as reflecting the average quality of the facility's stormwater runoff. when, where, and how a sample is collected can greatly impact how representative it is. And be careful about run-on from neighboring sites and from non-industrial areas.
Most of the time, the location for collecting a representative sample will be determined ahead of time by the QUISP and should be reliable. But in the field, things can change. High water levels mean the original sampling location can be unsafe, or maybe water from the neighbor's property has backed up into your discharge point. You must be able to adapt, come up with a plan B, and still collect a representative sample. Stormwater samples are collected in order to get a realistic assessment of how well a stormwater management program is performing.
Ready to start? In this video, we are going to look at 3 very common sampling scenarios and talk through some approaches to collecting samples for each one.
Don't forget your sampling equipment, which may include a sample kit, drain grate hook, sample boom, chain of custody form, and pH meter. If you're going to be in traffic areas, bring some traffic cones too, but the exact equipment you need will be dependent on site-specific sampling logistics.
Let's check out our first scenario, sheet flow.
One of the most common and challenging types of stormwater discharge to sample is sheet flow. Sheet flow is when stormwater doesn't collect in a ditch or channel, but runs off across the surface of a facility in a thin sheet.
Here, it looks like we have someone trying to grab a sheet flow sample using a dustpan, but it's not working out. Right about now, he is probably wishing he could make a low spot in the pavement. Let's think about this. Does this sample look representative of the water leaving his property? What about all the dirt he stirred up digging that hole?
This is definitely not the best way to collect a representative sheet flow sample. Let's go back and see what he did wrong. First of all, it looks like he was using a dustpan to try and collect his sample. Although this may sound like a reasonable way to collect a sample, the analytical method used for testing oil and grease does not allow water samples to be transferred from container to container, or the result may be biased low. This extends to the sample collection. No intermediate containers or sample collection devices may be used to collect an oil and grease sample. Dustpans, pitchers, or plastic bags are not allowed. The oil tends to stick to the sides of the intermediate containers, removing it from the sample and causing inaccurate analytical results.
If you're using automatic samplers, things get a little complicated. We're not going to get into the details of using auto samplers in this video, but you should know that auto samplers must be specifically designed to handle parameters like oil and grease and pH. Another problem is that he is contaminating the stormwater sample by stepping in the water that he is sampling. The sample collector should always stand downstream or out of the water flow if possible.
Our sampler then digs a hole in the nearby gravel and then uses his dustpan to collect the water. It turns out he's onto something here, but this is definitely the wrong approach. The sediment disturbed by digging ends up in his stormwater sample. That is not representative of what was flowing off his site. And he's still using the dustpan, so sorry, pal.
Now, we asked the quiz to look at the sampling location and suggest a better way to collect stormwater samples without breaking the bank or installing any major modifications. This is what she came up with.
But remember, although this is a better sampling solution for a particular discharge point, it might not work at your facility. Pay attention to the concepts used here, not the specifics.
When the QUISP saw this sampling location, she saw the need for 2 things. First, some sort of low spot must be installed to allow the sample bottles to be filled directly, without using a secondary container. This problem was solved by installing a small underground pull box at the sampling location. The pull box is deep enough to accommodate the sample bottles. When not collecting samples, the lid is left closed, and the stormwater flows over the pull box and discharges off-site. Second, the flow must be increased or concentrated in some way to make it easier to collect the sample.
Whenever you are collecting samples, it is important to pay attention to your safety. Many times, your sample collection point might be in a vehicle or equipment traffic area. Not a great place to be working close to the ground. Make sure you are visible, and if possible, use the buddy system.
Personal protective equipment is also important. Sampling usually involves cold weather conditions, slippery surfaces, caustic chemicals, and dirty water. Make sure you're wearing appropriate clothing and footwear and use powder-free gloves and eye protection when handling stormwater or sample bottles. Also, don't forget about other PPE that may be required by your facility.
Avoid smoking, eating, or drinking while collecting samples. Not only is it not safe, but there is a chance you can contaminate your sample.
Now, let's move on to our second scenario, drain inlets. Collecting representative stormwater samples from drain inlets can be challenging, especially if there is a drain insert bag or other BMP installed, like in this case.
It looks like our sampler here is struggling with the drain insert bag. Having drain insert bags installed at sampling locations is almost always a problem, because at any time the bag is disturbed, it releases trapped pollutants and sediment back into the stormwater and right into your sample bottle.
It looks like he's collecting a sample from the conveyance pipe at the bottom of the catch basin. Remember, looking for representative stormwater samples, and what our sampler did here was not the best way to capture a representative sample from a drain inlet. Let's see what he did wrong and find out what he could do better. The first problem that we see here is the facility has installed a drain bag at their sampling point. Drain bags can be great BMPs, but having one installed at your sample point can make it difficult to grab a representative sample, especially here where it looks like the holding straps have become weathered and brittle. Remember, samples should be collected after the BMP, which in this case results in a bunch of sediment being released and flowing right where he is collecting his sample.
The second problem is that our sampler is not using good sampling technique. It looks like there is not a lot of flow in this drain, so he is scraping the bottom of the catch basin to fill up his sample bottle. This is not a representative sample because he is stirring up and sampling whatever material might have been lying at the bottom of this catch basin, which may contain pollutants left over from years past, or may have come from non-industrial sources. At any rate, it is not representative of the water leaving the facility. And if there was any preservative in the laboratory supplied sample bottle, he lost it while scraping the bottom of the catch basin and disqualified the sample. Unfortunately, these problems with sampling technique caused high analytical results, which were noticed by the water boards. The facility was inspected by the Regional Water Quality Control Board, who issued a notice of violation for inadequate sampling protocols and a non-compliance monitoring program. The facility contracted with a QUISP to respond to the violation. Let's see what the QUISP recommended for a better sampling setup.
In addition to more regular sweeping and good housekeeping, the QUISP recommended that the facility remove the drain insert bag and replace it with a drop-in filter unit with a sampling port. And after studying the facility's drainage system, the QUISP determined that the most representative sample from this drain inlet should come from the water flowing into the drain, not from the water flowing in the stormwater pipe down below.
This does two things. First, by installing a plastic drop-in filter with a sampling port, the BMP no longer has to be disturbed when collecting a sample. This means all of that sediment captured by the BMP will stay put until it can be cleaned and disposed of. Second, the drain insert funnels all of the water flowing into the drain through the filtration unit and out through a single opening in the bottom. This provides the sampler with a representative and post-BMP sample of the water flowing into the drain.
It is important to know where you should take the sample in the drain inlet. This depends on each particular drain and drainage system. In this case, the sampler collected samples from the drain line at the bottom of the catch basin. But because of possible commingling in the drain line, the QUISP determines a sample from the water flowing into the drain would be more representative.
Also, remember how the sampler was scraping the bottom of the catch basin while collecting the sample? This brings up a good point. You should never touch the sides or surface of the drain inlet with the sample bottle. You might contaminate the sample or break the glass bottle.
Don't forget about safety. Did you notice the traffic cones? If you're in an area with vehicle traffic, make sure you're visible.
Okay, let's move on to our last example, manholes.
Taking stormwater samples from a manhole is a little less complicated than sheet flow or drain inlet samples, but there are still a few things you need to consider.
It looks like he is using a sample boom, which is good. Keep in mind that manholes are confined spaces. You should never enter a manhole without a confined space entry permit and proper training.
But it looks like he's having trouble collecting a sample from the bottom of the manhole, so he is just filling up his bottle from that other pipe.
The problem is, we don't know where that pipe is coming from, and if he was supposed to collect a sample from the conveyance pipe, sampling from that other pipe is not a representative sample. Let's see how the QUISP approaches this situation.
After studying the facility's drainage system, the QUISP determined that the water from both lines was industrial stormwater runoff and that a representative sample should be taken after the water coming out of the pipe commingles with the water in the conveyance line. In order to solve the low flow situation, the QUISP recommended that the facility install a weir inside the manhole, which should be epoxy to the side of the manhole to prevent leaks. The weir would cause the water to back up inside the line, eventually becoming deep enough to collect the sample with the sample bottle.
One thing to be aware of when installing a weir like this is that it changes when your facility discharges. Only collect samples after the water flows over the weir and any initially impounded water is cleared from the system. A system like this will also require maintenance. The area upstream of the weir will tend to fill up with sediment and other pollutants, and will need regular inspections and cleaning.
Okay, let's summarize. The purpose of this video is to give you general guidance, not an exhaustive sampling manual.
There are many things that we didn't cover about collecting stormwater samples, but that are important for you to know.
Make sure to read the current industrial general permit, especially those sections relating to stormwater monitoring and sampling.
The most important thing that you should learn from this video is the concept of representative sampling. As a QUISP, you must look at the facility's drainage system and figure out the most representative sampling locations.
Collecting stormwater samples is not just about filling up bottles, it's about getting an accurate snapshot of the facility's stormwater quality. It determines the facility's public compliance story. The data informs future facility investments in BMPs, and high-quality statewide data helps inform the Water Board's future permit development. I'm Shuka with the State Water Board.
And I'm Brandon with the State Water Board. Happy sampling.
Well, there we have it. I hope we're able to see our screen again, but that was we helped them with that video, and I found it was really comprehensive and a good one. Also, I was informed that there was a question concerning pH following earlier, but I think it was answered, if I'm not mistaken. So I just want to make sure that we're good, that it was answered. Any questions? To kind of recap some of the things he was saying, one of the things I like, which they talked about, was, first of all, the guy walked through his discharge that was going down the drain. I don't know if you remember, but when we first started talking on this, basically I was saying, make sure to think ahead, plan ahead. That's the best way. So having a place where you know water's going to go. That one picture I showed you earlier, where it showed the bumper, they used a specialized non-tainting glue that they use to glue it down to redirect the water to that sample box. There's a lot of things you can do, but a lot of it requires having things put in place ahead of time, like the weir in the drain. Again, something you need to install ahead of time. Just kind of thinking through a little bit will help you. Even if you're in the middle of the season and you identify these things, I would still consider putting them in, even if you're in the middle of the wet season, simply so that maybe the second half of the season, you'll have a better chance at a better quality sample than the first half of the season. So I'd like to open it up for questions. We have 10 minutes left, or 9 minutes left on this session. And I think we pretty much went over it. If there's any questions, I'm more than welcome to entertain any questions. I don't see any on the chat. Maybe there are. Rebecca, do we have any questions in the chat?
Not that I've seen.
Okay. Well, I hope that helps to answer some questions. Like I said, the video and our talk today was to give you some general recommendations on approaches to how to sample, where to sample. You want to get someone who's got some experience. Sometimes someone with experience can help point out things that maybe you may not have noticed before. Again, if you can capture or slow down water or have it soak into the ground, I'd recommend that only because it helps you to reduce the number of samples you have to collect. Remember, if you can walk away with anything, walk away with one is you want a representative sample. 2, if you can capture more of your water so it doesn't leave every time it rains and it actually goes into the ground, that's best, because you're only required to have samples if there's a discharge, water leaves your property. And if you think through, you think ahead, you have the best chance for the best quality discharge that will reflect in your samples. Again, not dirtier, but neither cleaner. You just want to do what represents what you're leaving. If there's any more questions, then I think that will conclude our training session for today. Thank you, everybody, again, for coming. Again, we have the handouts and we have a certificate that you can download on the resources section of the Stormwater Awareness page. And thank you for coming and thank you for joining us on our training session.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And if you want to know where Stormwater Awareness Week is going next, our last workshop of the week is happening at 3 o'clock. You can join it from our website. And we're going to be talking about the next chapter of Stormwater Awareness Week. So if you're interested, head over to that workshop at 3. If not, have a great rest of your week. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.